looking at globalization from the perspective of the Communist Party of China. We are always taught about globalization from the Western perspective. We are taught by the West that globalization is the result of the capitalist West's victory over the communist Soviet Union. We not only reject this Western perspective, but also will see globalization from the perspective of the Communist Party of China, the most successful socioeconomic and political institution in the era of globalization. We can summarize our position as this: globalization is the outcome of the victory of communist-led anti-imperialist movements over Western colonialism. Victory of anti-imperialist movement against the West. From 1917, the Communist Party of Soviet Union led the anti-imperialist movement against the West. After World War II, communist parties emerged victorious in Eastern Europe and China. The West failed to maintain colonial governments in the face of communist-led anti-imperialist movements. Communists were emerging successful by raising the demand for independence and urge for rapid industrialization. Soviet state-led industrialization model was land reform, state-led investment in education, health, infrastructure, and heavy industries. These investments gave no direct profits, but raised the collective productivity. So state-led planned resource allocation was necessary instead of privately led market allocation. As more countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia followed the Soviet model, the West itself developed a corporatist mode of the model in Taiwan, South Korea, and Malaysia to check the growth of communism. In the 1970s, the West started to relent in the pressure of the anti-imperialist mass. The West, led by the US, recognized Communist China and Communist East Germany and allowed Saudi-led OPEC cartel to raise oil price much above production cost. Rise and fall of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The post-World War II boom of 1950 and 1960s also ended in the 70s. The post-war boom was led by the fact that the US acted as an export market for Western Europe and Japan. In 1945, the US share of global GDP was as much as 45%, while Western Europe and Japan had 30%, measured in PPP. So the US started to act as the export destination of the West. Europe and Japan, as the US dollar was the most acceptable global currency to suit the purpose. The dollar was fixed with the price of gold, but by 1970, it had fallen down to approximately 33% for each of the US, as well as Western Europe and Japan. So the US economy became too small to serve as an export destination for the latter. This forced the US dollar depreciation and fixed relations with gold price, finally collapsing in 1971. This is the collapse of Bretton Woods. Financial capitalism. Anti-imperialist movement and economic crisis of 1970s pushed the US into financial capitalism. Financial capitalism means more investment in unproductive asset trading. Capitalism did this to get rid of the overproduction crisis. But to keep asset trading profitable, you need to constantly inflate asset prices. This can only be done by channeling debt into asset market. The USA settled the fact by using its geopolitical strength, which inherited after World War II from the Anglo-French-Dutch colonial empires. The US asked oil-rich Gulf states to sell oil in US dollars only and save the earned income in the US asset market by buying US Treasury bills. Oil is needed by all countries, and so the US dollar got a huge global demand boost both as a medium of exchange and store of value. Thus, the whole world started to deposit their earnings and liabilities in the US asset market. The US Federal Reserve then distributes these deposits throughout the asset market as debt. Thus, the US asset market gets a steady flow of debt, which keeps inflating its asset prices and hence profits from asset trading. Western Europe and Japan also tried to follow the US model of financial capitalism, but they failed because they had no geopolitical influence as the US had, so they gradually became stagnant by the 1990s. Globalization. As the US began to concentrate in asset trading, it started to export its manufacturing base to cheap, yet productive, labor-endowed third-world countries. Here, an important point overlapped is the fact that for making profit only, cheap labor is not enough. labor needs to be productive as well. Profits cease to maximize the difference between average productivity and average cost. All third world countries' labor are cheap, but not productive enough. To increase productivity, a country needs to have an independent nation-state, land reforms, investment in education, health, infrastructure, and basic industries. Initially, the West and Japan tried to export its manufacturing base to Taiwan, South Korea, and Malaysia, where this model was followed to stem the tide of communism. But by the 1970s, it was communist China, with its huge pool of productive, cheap labor, that attracted US attention. So the US started to export its manufacturing base to China, and itself relied on asset trading. Gradually, the globalization model emerged in the 1990s, where the US acted as a main source of global demand and China as the ultimate source of global supply. Soviet failed to adapt to new reality. The Soviet Union failed to adapt to the new reality. The Soviet Union failed to prosper in the new material condition due to many reasons. Soviet Union was designed to counter the imperialism in the first half of the 20th century. By the 1970s, the old imperialist model was defeated and a new financial capitalist model had emerged. This new model lured erstwhile colonies with the promise of higher prices for oil, greater access to the US market, and more sharing of technology and liquidity. So naturally, third world countries liberated by the Soviet Union began to drift away towards the West in the 1980s. Soviet leaders tried to reform the old model, but in a wrong way. The Soviet leaders dethroned Communist Party and brought multi-party democracy and launched indiscriminate privatization. The result was dissolution of the Soviet Union. The West thought this was the victory of capitalism. We clearly say no. It could have been capitalist victory if Russia emerged economically prosperous after embracing capitalism. Instead, Russia and most of erstwhile socialist countries lost human capital and faced deindustrialization. The West's wrong understanding of globalization led to its downfall. The West thought it had defeated communism with the fall of the Soviet Union, so the West could return to the pre-Soviet days of colonialism. This belief led the US to invade both Afghanistan and Iraq. The false belief naturally resulted in disaster for US and the West. The US lost money, time, and its military was exposed to be weak in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Words like democracy and freedom became synonymous with colonialism. Correct understanding of globalization by the Chinese Communist Party. What did Chinese leadership do? They upheld the Communist Party rule and allowed private business to operate in consumer goods industries while keeping key sectors mostly under state leadership. So the Chinese did not destroy the base created during the 1950s and 60s, but added elements like competition and private ownership to attract Western technology and liquidity and get more access to Western markets. But Taiwan, South Korea, and Malaysia did the same, right? No. We can say China and these countries opened similarly up to the 2008 crisis. But after that, China took a decisive new course, which only a socialist country can. China took center stage of globalization. The 2008 crisis happened mainly due to the fact that the US economy became too small to act as the source of global demand. Its source of global GDP fell to 18%, while the Chinese economy became so big that it couldn't rely on the Western market alone. Its global GDP share rose to 11%. So China began to invest in infrastructure in a big way. This is impossible for a capitalist society because investment in infrastructure in most cases has long gestation periods and capital in search of quick profit avoids them. Chinese state-owned enterprises undertook most of such non-profitable yet productive employment-generating and hence demand-generating investments. First, between 2008 and 2013, they did it inside of China. By 2013, China, under Xi Jinping, offered this model throughout the globe. This is epitomized as the Belt Road Initiative. Thus, China now started to lead globalization by creating demand through non-profitable infrastructure investment. China is now establishing itself not only as the main supply source of globalization, but also as the main demand source. The US is gradually being pushed out of its chief role in the global economy. This is clearly reflected in Trump's anti-globalization policies against the WTO, Paris Accord, and WHO. The US's share of the global GDP in 2019 is just 15.11%, while for China, it's 19.25%, again in PPP. The West has failed to create any liberal democracy-led success story. Between 1980 and 2008, the US acted as a main source of global demand, while China acted only as one source of global supply. Southeast Asian growth slowed, West Europe and Japan stagnated economically, Eastern Europe and USSR republics, including the Russian Federation, showed loss of income. Third world countries like Arabs, Africans, and Latin America, third world countries in Central Asia, Africa, and South America mainly grew by selling raw materials to China. India showed some autonomous growth, but much lower than China. If the West could show at least one success story under capitalism, China would not have been so powerful. Our conclusion is this: the Soviet Union defeated the old Western imperialist model. This forced the West to adapt a financial capitalist model, which resulted in globalization. Endowed with cheap and productive labor, Communist China was better positioned to take the benefits of globalization compared with capitalist-ruled third world countries. So globalization is not the result of capitalist victory, rather is the result of communist victory over imperialism. And now Communist China is in a position to lead globalization.